Hey everybody, it's Chuck Johnson, editor-in-chief of gotnews.com. It is Friday, tax day, I think. Yeah, it's tax day. April 15th. Yeah, tax day. Good thing, hashtag my Asian wife took care of that. Highly recommend a numerate, intelligent wife, fellas. Particularly one that's cheap. So that's kind of like Asians, Scots, maybe Jews. I don't know. I had a Jewish girlfriend. Didn't go so well. Mostly my fault though, not hers. But yeah, so here we are. It is April 15th. And what are we going to talk about? We're not going to talk about taxes. We could. I mean, I could give you the whole standard libertarian mumbo jumbo about taxes this, taxes that, how bad taxes are. Frankly, I think there's any natural rate of taxation that exists among populations, particularly among welfare states, warfare states such as the United States. And so I don't really think it's going to change all that much. I mean, you could change this thing or change that thing, but the government's going to get its due one way or another, or there's going to be an informal economy that's going to grow up. And I think that's probably the future of the United States. I think we're going to be much more like Mexico, and of course, like California. As Mexico goes, so goes California. And I think that that's sort of the future of where we're going. And so my general sense is the informal economy is much larger, much more serious, much more crazy than a lot of people want to admit in the United States. And of course, there's a barter economy that goes on underground, which a lot of people don't see. The more the taxation there is, the more you can trust your neighbors in a sort of ethno-state area, the more you kind of trade favors. You know, I'll watch your kids, you watch my dog, I'll feed your parrot, you mow my lawn, that sort of thing. And the higher the taxes go, the more that becomes a situation. So anyways, yours truly, editor-in-chief of Got News, I'm kind of a bookworm. As some of you may know, I wrote a book about Calvin Coolidge. I wrote another short book about the IRS, both by Encounter Books. I haven't decided yet. I'm thinking of writing a book about Obama. I'm thinking of writing, I've written a lot of it already, sort of the real Barack Obama. I was writing one about opposition research, yeah, sort of the future of Oppo research, where it's going, what it's about, the tribalism that's going to be happening on the internet, which I've sort of finished too. If any of you guys want to read some of this stuff or want to edit it or whatever, email me at editor@gotnews. This is sort of my crime thing. I think I'll probably self-publish both books, not because I don't have an agent or not because publishers aren't knocking down my door, but because the economics of the book world just don't make a lot of sense to me. Like the margin seems kind of bullshit to me. Maybe that's what I get from years of selling clothing in my parents' store, hippie store, Mikasa in Massachusetts. That's what they actually called it, believe it or not. So I like margins. So in any event, I'm here today to talk to you about some books that I've been reading and been thinking about a lot lately. One of the things that I think is kind of annoying about our modern era is that people don't read. People don't read books. They read tweets. They don't get immersed in things. And I'm not going to lecture people. I mean, I think there's room for sensationalism in everybody's life. I think nothing wrong with a little smut now and again. I'm not a moralist. I don't think we could go back to that world even if we wanted to. But a diet of only smut is a mind only of smut. And so I think it's important to read good books, just great books. That's one of the things I learned from my Straussian education at Claremont. One of the things I learned working in libraries when I was a kid. And in fact, I think in my hometown, my siblings and I still have the record for the most fines overdue library books in the history of the town. I don't know if that's been supplanted yet. They did get a new library. I don't know if they necessarily keep records on that. Maybe I shouldn't have admitted it, although Google probably already knows it. But in any event, I've been reading 3 books. Actually going to finish them, been thinking about them a lot. Thinking of writing an essay about them, but obviously there's the great Ann Coulter, Adios America. Ann is a friend. Don't always necessarily agree with her, but like her work, especially her latest. Like this is an important book. I think it's basically changed the conversation in this country about immigration. I know Donald Trump has obviously done that. I know that Donald Trump read this book, and I highly recommend it to you. It's a very, if you're not a big reader, this is a book for you to kind of get in and understand what's going on the immigration issue. And it's done in sort of an engaging, funny way. Anne has a style all her own, and she's sort of, in my view, the queen of the right. Michelle Malkin, I think, does good work, but nonetheless, I'm sort of the view that Ann Coulter has figured out how to turn trolling into a lucrative career, and she's sort of like, she was one of the first real serious people to raise serious questions, and she's very good about writing to a news cycle. So highly recommend this book. Now, one of the books that this book mentions, and which has been very influential in my thinking, is a book called Who Are We? It's by Samuel Huntington. This, by the way, is a stolen copy from the Who Are We? From the Milton Academy Library, where I worked. So yeah, I think the statute of limitations has run out. But anyways, you guys overcharged me for prom, even though you said that I was a scholarship student, and so made me pay the full price. And even though you said I could go to prom and you'd cover the cost. So I feel kind of guilty about stealing from it, but maybe this book was liberated. I don't think it was going to be read at Milton Academy anyways, given how lefty a school it was. But one of the things I've been thinking about, and I've read this book, by the way, in John Pitney's class at Claremont McKenna. This question of who are we, what are we, is a question I've been thinking about a lot in the context of the United States, especially given massive levels of immigration, massive changes in the demos population. Now, it's worth mentioning that we don't really have an immigration problem insofar as we have a Mexico problem and a Central America problem. That's where our source of labor comes from. That's where our source of people come from. And there's a great new book, by the way, that I've gotten galley copies of. I don't know where the galley copies are. I think my wife might have thrown them out. But it's by this guy, I think his last name's Borjas. It's called We Wanted Workers. And it is written by an immigrant himself, a guy by the name of George Borjas. And it's a really interesting book. It basically talks about, it's a Harvard professor essentially talking about how the economy is, how there are winners and losers from immigration. I know what you're saying. Duh, of course there are. But the fact that it's written by a Harvard Kennedy School professor, suggests that the Overton window, that is the range of acceptable ideas that people are willing to tolerate, has really shifted on the immigration issue. Now, Samuel Huntington was also a professor of Harvard. I believe he's dead now. And he was sort of like the go-to guy. He was an internationalist. He had written The Clash of Civilizations, which I highly recommend to you if you want to understand the growing tribalism of our era. And in his book, there are a lot of really pregnant insights on what you can expect over the future of the 21st century. And it's well worth reading. I mean, there's stuff in here about Protestantism, Anglo-Protestant culture. If you've read the book Albion Seed by David Hackett Fisher, you got some inclination of this. This is the America that once existed no longer exists because of mass immigration from the third world. And it's interesting, as a white guy who kind of grew up in the Boston area and who went away to college in California, I think the California that my father lived in back when he was a kid was 88% white, something like that. Could have the figures off, but I know the California that I live in is 44% white. So that's within a generation, that demographic change. It's quite remarkable, quite interesting. And so anyways, the point of Albion Seed, the point of Who Are We, the point of George Borjas's book is to talk about how the foundational stock of a country, it's sort of the operating system for you, my engineer fans, that matters considerably to the future of a country. If you import a new people, you import a new voter base, you import a new culture, and that ultimately changes the population. Now, why should we care? Well, why you should care is there's a new book, and we've already talked about Tyler Cowen's book, The Great Stagnation, that essentially all of the low-hanging fruit of globalization, all of the low-hanging fruit of technology have been harvested, and that essentially we're going to become much poorer as a society. There's going to be much more wealth at the top, many more poorer people in the West, that this sort of middle-class existence that we all have come to know and love, that it might be going by the by. And anyways, there's this new book, and it's by, I want to say, I'm trying to find the guy's name. I always mispronounce it. I think it's Gordon. last name Robert Gordon, named Robert Gordon. It's about, I haven't read this book yet, but it's on my list. My wife, by the way, has forced me to to have all my books on Kindle, and unless they're out of print, because otherwise I clog up the living room and can't have that. By the way, my dog likes to actually eat books. Like actually eat them. I have a few. I eat books and credit cards. I don't really know what's up with that. But anyways, this new book by Robert Gordon is essentially, it's called The Rise and Fall of American Growth. And he is laying out, as an economist, as only an economist can, what's happening. And what's happening, he's a professor at Northwestern University. And I'll link an interview that he did with Brian Lamb over at C-SPAN Q&A. And I highly recommend, by the way, I highly recommend watching Brian Lamb's show, just like I highly recommend watching Charlie Rose's show, even if you're more on the alt-right side of things. It's always important to know what your adversaries are thinking or not thinking, as the case may be. But Robert Gordon talks about essentially how between 1870 and 1970, it was a period of tremendous economic growth in the United States. Now, Gordon doesn't talk about the racial composition of the United States changing over that time, and how the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the 1965 Immigration Act essentially changed the operating system. My dog's right here. Come here, Ariel. Come here. No? You don't want to come here? All right. How it changed the operating system of the United States. And changed it largely for the worse. Even Dan Senor, who is a policy advisor, I put up some videos of his policy advising Paul Ryan, Speaker of the House, and also Mitt Romney. And I think he's also advised Netanyahu. Could be wrong on that, but I know he knows Netanyahu. He's a Jewish guy. Wrote a really interesting book called Startup Nation, which I have around here somewhere, about essentially how Israel has done so well economically. Anyways, he discusses how the U.S. has not had really real economic growth recently. And it's interesting to kind of think about kind of largely why that might have been. Obviously, it's a bubble. My sense is that the bubbles of since basically 2000 are creatures of the Fed. And one of the things that I'm interested in exploring intellectually is the role in which central banking plays in multiracial societies. How it can paper over differences that exist between populations, how it changes the economics of a country. And so I don't necessarily think that as Japan goes, so goes the United States. I think it's much more complicated, and that central banking might actually be much worse in countries that are multiracial, because it leads to ethnic tribalism and it leads to all kinds of other problems. But in any event, there's some books I recommend to you. Who Are We? Happy to chat with you about those books in either comment section here or through email. I'm thinking of starting a book reading group or something on the internet. I haven't really decided what the form of it's going to be, but I do read a lot. I do think it's important to read a lot. Highly recommend this book too, Mexifornia. I look like kind of a library thief here, like all the books here. I bought Ann Coulter's book. Okay, I bought it. This one I bought too, although I think I got it online. Mexifornia is by Victor Davis Hanson. It was sort of ahead of its time. I think it was printed in, I want to say, the 90s. Yeah, I think it was. No, maybe early 2003. So over 10 years ago, 13 years ago. And it's an interesting book. It essentially talks about how California is being Mexicanized. And this is important because what's happening in California and is happening in the rest of the country is essentially demographic revolution. We don't talk about it that way. We don't talk about what's really going on, but it's real. It's I must tell you, living here in the Central Valley, I see it every single day. My wife sees it every single day. We see what's going on. And what's happening is there's a demographic transformation going on in the United States. And it's encouraged by Central American governments, by the Mexican government, because they get, they export their people to the United States, and they get a percentage of the money that comes back. As many of you may know, my uncle lives in Guatemala, where he has lived, I guess, for the last 20 years or so now, maybe somewhere around there. And I've gotten to visit him a few times. I've been down there, seen kind of the wildness of what's down there. I've been to Honduras, Nicaragua, um, Mexico, all throughout Mexico. And this is a real red pill moment, I must tell you. Like the way in which they live versus the way we live, the way in which they live in the United States versus the way we live in the United States. It's a very red pilling kind of thing. Um, so what is it? What is this all about? Well, the reason I'm interested in this is we don't spend enough time thanking the creators in our society, which are largely Jewish, largely white male, largely Northern European white male, and the ways in which there might be an ethnic mix. If we are going to be a tossed salad or a melting pot, there might be an appropriate mix of that melting pot that's worth considering. If I make spaghetti sauce and I put in too much paprika or oregano, I could spoil the sauce. If I put in just too much wine, I get everyone drunk. Now, these are things to think through. Think, what is the ideal racial composition of a society? Might there be too much diversity? Might there be too little? These are things that we don't actually think about. We don't think in terms of, we assume that diversity is always a good. But if that were true, why are we seeing what we're seeing in Europe? These are the rape fugees of what's going on over there is quite disturbing, and I'm afraid it's coming to a neighborhood near you. So join your local militia, of course. Form one if you don't have one. And looking forward to chatting more offline with you guys in the near future.